Last week, a mother in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, brutally murdered her 2 children. Days later, the situation was turned into propaganda by the Human Rights Campaign. This is a story about the disingenuous nature of the trans murder rate. On Monday, February 22nd, Crescinda Ann Bright walked into her 22-year-old daughter's room and shot her in the head as she lay in bed. Following the murder of her eldest child, Crescinda proceeded downstairs where she aimed the gun at her 16-year-old transgender son's head and pulled the trigger, only for the gun to malfunction. As the mother stood and fiddled with the weapon to get it working, her son pleaded with her to stop, saying, "Please don't shoot, I'm gonna call the police." But Crescinda could not be wavered, and upon fixing the weapon, she shot her son in the face, only for him to not immediately die. According to police records, Crescinda didn't want her son to suffer, so she went and grabbed another gun and returned to the grisly scene where she shot him in the head once again, ending his existence. Following the destruction of life within her household, Crescinda called 911 to let him know what she'd done, unloaded the gun and set it on a dining room table, and then proceeded outside to wait on the porch until police arrived and arrested her. As reported on by LGBTQ Nation, which received a statement from Crescinda Bright's cousin, the crime was carried out after the mother, who happens to be a military veteran, experienced a PTSD break. She allegedly doesn't know what triggered her episode, nor does she even know what happened, as she didn't snap out of it until after the incident occurred. Whatever the reasoning for the murders happens to be, based on the evidence presented, it's safe to assume that her transgender son's gender identity played no role in what occurred. He wasn't even the first victim. Yet, as to now be expected, this hasn't stopped the political arm of the LGBT community from swooping in to put a finger on the scale of the transgender murder tally. In a tweet fired off on February 26, the Human Rights Campaign wrote that it is horrified to learn of the death of Jeffrey Bright, the 16-year-old transgender boy who was murdered, adding that his death is at least the 8th violent death of a transgender person in 2021. Notice, it makes no mention of his oldest sister. In the article linked to the tweet, it discusses where Jeffrey went to school, his role in a local LGBTQ+ youth organization, and his smile, all before ever so briefly mentioning that he was just one of 2 victims, this vital detail buried under multiple paragraphs. Although perhaps making it all the more disgustingly cynical is that, before that fact is presented, in ultra big letters is a quote from the HRC's Director of Community Engagement for the Transgender Justice Initiative, Tori Cooper, who laments how young Jeffrey was and the tragedy of his murder given he had friends, family, a community, and a life. Her quote further adds that our hearts go out to everyone in JJ's community. As this high rate of violence against transgender people continues, we need everyone to keep mobilizing, keep speaking up, and keep supporting trans lives. I guess his sister isn't important. There's actually a ton more I could discuss about the disingenuous nature of the article, like how it brings up guns used in hate crimes, even though JJ's death offers no evidence that it was a hate crime in the traditional sense. But the most important detail as I see it are the calls for action that it makes multiple times, be it Tori Cooper's quote or the paragraphs dedicated towards pushing the LGBT community to get active within the political sphere. As I wrote on this very topic just over a year ago, there is no trans murder epidemic within the United States, and the stats are very heavily skewed. This ranges from tallying people who weren't even murdered at all to those who died in mass shootings where gender identity played zero role in their being shot. When broken down and adequately investigated, it becomes clear that the majority of trans people murdered in any given year are not murdered because they are trans. That certainly doesn't mean that every murder isn't a hate crime, as some individuals are most definitely killed because of their gender, but it's incredibly misleading to tally every murder victim on a list about anti-transgender violence, which is exactly what the HRC is doing. There's already a video on this channel that explores the subject further and which breaks down the death stat in more detail, so I suggest you watch that if you want to know more. But as a trans person myself, I am tired of being turned into a political tool. And in my opinion, it is vital that more trans individuals recognize that we're being used. Because in its current form, the trans murder stat is nothing more than a tool for left-wing political groups to scare the LGBT community. It is propaganda in its purest form. There's a reason why the HRC's article about Jeffrey Bright is presented as it is, and why Tory Cooper's large quote is cupped above the tidbit that his sister was also killed. They need transgender people to believe they're at higher risk of being murdered because that fear goes a long ways towards pushing them towards particular candidates. This was all but admitted to in 2017 during the HRC National Dinner when then organization president Chad Griffin said,
"History. It's critical that we organize and mobilize the 10 million LGBTQ voters in this country, which, by the way, is a voting bloc that's larger than the margin of victory of every presidential election since 1984. But we're not just targeting LGBTQ voters. We also need to turn out the 52 million equality voters that we've identified, family, friends, and other allies."
Keep in mind that the HRC's list is highlighted each year from people such as Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, and Chelsea Clinton. Once again, I'm going to recommend my other video on this matter as it delves into this topic further and highlights examples of this. But what people need to understand is that to the political elite and their allies, the LGBT community is an electoral tool, and they hold no qualms about using the dead to achieve its goal. It is an utterly disgusting use of murder victims. What happened to Jeffrey Bright and his sister Jasmine Kennedy is a tragedy in its purest form. And given the prevalence of PTSD among military veterans, a vital discussion should be had about the mental trauma they go through and the carnage it can lead to when not properly treated. But instead, that potential conversation has been ripped away by selfish organizations so that one dead body out of two can be used to push fear. Or that was the case. Because this story took another harsh turn, one which only further proves the point I'm trying to make. Following my reporting on the story last week, which among the links down in the description citing sources for this video you can find my original article, it came out that JJ's sister identified as non-binary, a tidbit of info I was able to verify on their Facebook page. It was here that the HRC leapt into action and immediately began politicizing not just the one corpse they already had been, but the second as well. As my astute viewers may have noticed, when discussing the HRC article about JJ, the screenshots within this very video are from an archived version of the piece dated back to March 1st. This because if you view the article in its current form, its headline has been updated and there's a note to go along with it. The original headline read, HRC mourns Jeffrey J.J. Bright, trans teen killed in Pennsylvania, and it was this version where the death of J.J.'s sibling was buried, because I guess there's no point in mourning anyone but those whom can be turned into political props. Something the HRC clearly believes, because following the news that Jasmine was non-binary, they dug deep inside themselves and found extra sadness because the headline now reads, HRC mourns Jeffrey J.J. Bright and Jasmine Kennedy, trans and non-binary siblings killed in Pennsylvania. Let that genuinely sink in. Like really, let it sink in. The HRC saw almost no reason to mourn, let alone mention JJ's sibling until it was revealed that they checked a specific identity box. A blatantly cynical and just frankly disgusting level of disingenuous politicalization. Further adding to this horrid display of false sympathies is that the Tory Cooper quote is still prominently displayed in the article. And it is word for word the exact same, except that she found it in herself to jam Jasmine's name in there. Its final line perhaps being the most obvious in what the organization is doing, because following calls to mobilize, the original quote said, keep supporting trans lives. And now it says, keep supporting trans and non-binary lives. I don't know how to stress this more than I already have, but it needs to be known that this organization doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about trans lives, non-binary lives, or even gay lives. All the organization cares about is that it scares people of such identities into voting a specific way. And they will pluck up fresh corpses and prop them up just to achieve that goal. I mean, how else can you explain the fact that 2 children were killed, and they leapt at the opportunity to just use one of them into calls for action, all while ignoring the other up until they saw an opportunity to then use the second corpse for the same end goals, all while offering up false sympathies. Spelled out loud and clear, the HRC is merely an arm of the DNC, one which turns LGBT individuals into voting booth tokens. And it works damn hard to create narratives that manipulate a significant portion of the population. Circling back around to Crescinda Ann Bright, I believe her crime wasn't motivated by anti-transgender sentiments, no matter how hard certain organizations are going to work to convince you of that. It does not appear this was a hate crime. As her cousin stated, it was a PTSD break. And most certainly, family members can lie in an effort to come to the defense of those they grew up knowing. But while browsing pages upon pages of this family's friends and relatives on Facebook, I saw people who in no way believe Crescinda is an evil bigot. For example, Brittany Kennedy was incredibly close to JJ and Jasmine, and even she was sharing a post from a friend who stated that while they can't forgive Crescinda for what she did, they still love her, even expressing that she held a deep love for her children. Now, I understand how this can be hard for some people to digest given she brutally murdered her own kids. But PTSD and other forms of trauma can cause people to act out horrific deeds, things they would never otherwise do under normal circumstances. And based off all the evidence I've encountered, I think this was a true-to-life mental break and that she was disassociating during the ordeal. Annoyingly, her own Facebook page is kind of barren, presumably limiting what those who are not in her network of friends can see due to privacy filters. But what is public offers up a picture of a woman who cared about her friends and family. She even had a picture in support of trans lives. And all of this taken into consideration with what those who knew her and her daughters have to say, I gotta double down on my belief that this murder had nothing to do with the gender identities of her children. Yet because the HRC is going to do what it does, they are now tallied on a list of anti-transgender violence. And if previous years are any indication, they will now be named off by politicians as a means of convincing trans people that we're at a higher risk of being murdered because of who and what we are. As a transgender individual myself, I am both angry and incredibly sad at the current state of affairs. And more people need to wake up to the manipulation tactics used by those with power whom claim to care. If you're LGBT yourself, wake the fuck up and don't believe their lies.
Good to see you, Senator. So, Senator, if elected president, what should LGBTQ Americans expect from the first 100 days in office?
So good to be here with you. I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to show you.
Stop killing us. How do we get those men to stop killing trans women of color? We are hunted.
I know.
Systematically.
I know.
How do we do that?
No, you're right.
Dana Martin, Jasleen Ware, Ashanti Carmen, Claire Legato, Malaysia Booker, Michelle Tamika Washington.
There should be zero discrimination. And what's happening is too many transgender women of color are being murdered. They're being murdered. I mean, I think it's up to now 17. Don't hold me to that number, but it's higher now.
Yeah.
And that's just this year. And
Paris Cameron, Shinelle Lindsay, Chanel Spurlock, Zoe Spears, Brooklyn Lindsay, Denali Berry Stuckey, Kiki Fantroy, Pebbles LaDime Dime Doe.
We are hunted.
I know.
Systematically.
I know.
How do we do that?
18 trans women of color who have been killed so far this year. It is time for a president of the United States of America to say their names.